It was the kind of silence that didn't just surround you. It crawled into your mind, filling every corner until even the sound of your own heartbeat felt too loud. And yet, it wasn't the silence that terrified me the most. It was the feeling that something I couldn't see, was out there, watching, waiting. I would later look back on this moment, and realize it was the first warning, the moment I should have turned back before it was too late. Months before that night, this trip had started as a dream, a chance to leave behind the chaos of city life and reconnect with myself. My RV, a modest yet comfortable space with a fold-down bed and a small kitchen, became my sanctuary for the journey. It wasn't luxury, but it was enough, a home on wheels that promised freedom, solitude, and an endless stretch of open road. I set out with a simple plan: follow the Glen Highway, a winding route through the breathtaking Matanuska-Susitna Valley, then venture toward Denali National Park. I imagined quiet campsites, sweeping mountain views, and the kind of peace you can only find when you're completely alone. Alaska's untamed wilderness called to me with its vastness and stillness, offering the perfect escape. The first hours of the drive were everything I had hoped for. Sunlight poured through the windshield, illuminating the pale blue glaciers nestled between rugged green peaks. Small towns with little more than a gas station and a diner gave way to stretches of highway where the only signs of life were the occasional eagle soaring overhead, or a moose grazing in the distance. It was freedom distilled into every mile, and I savored it. As I drove farther from Anchorage, the world seemed to grow quieter, the trees closing in like a living tunnel. By the time I reached the Rogue River campground, the hum of civilization felt like a distant memory. I had read about this place in a travel blog, a remote spot with no amenities beyond a few picnic tables and pit toilets. It wasn't much, but it promised solitude, which was exactly what I was looking for. The gravel road leading into the campground was rough, the RV bouncing over ruts and dips as the dense forest pressed in on either side. When I arrived, the place was utterly deserted. No other vehicles, no campers, not even the distant echo of voices. Just an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It should have been comforting, a rare chance to be truly alone. But something about the emptiness felt off. I parked the RV at the farthest site, away from the entrance and any potential visitors, even though there were none. The spot was surrounded by trees, their towering trunks casting long shadows across the gravel. I stepped out, stretched, and took a deep breath of the crisp, pine-scented air. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally let go of everything that had been weighing me down. I set up a small folding chair outside and spent the afternoon reading a book, the sun casting a golden glow over the campsite. Occasionally, I glanced up at the forest, where squirrels darted through the underbrush and birds called to each other in the canopy. The silence was profound but not unsettling, at least, not yet. As evening approached, the light began to fade, and a chill crept into the air. I retreated to the RV to make dinner, the small space warming quickly as I prepared a simple meal of pasta and marinara sauce. Through the window, I watched the shadows grow longer, the forest around me shifting from serene to something darker, something unknowable. I should have left. Even then, with the weight of the silence pressing down on me, I should have seen the signs. But I didn't. Not yet. The trail that led into the woods, the strange absence of any other campers, the way the air seemed heavier as the light disappeared, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I wouldn't start to understand until it was far too late. The firelight flickered weakly, casting shifting shadows that danced across the dense forest. I remember gripping my flashlight tightly, its cold metal grounding me in a reality that felt increasingly distant. The moment I stepped onto that trail, unmarked, narrow, and swallowed by the trees, I felt it. A rawness that I couldn't name, but one that I could feel deep in my chest, like the echo of a warning left unsaid. That trail, winding and overgrown, would lead me to a discovery I can never unsee. It began innocently enough. After dinner, I decided to stretch my legs and explore the trail I'd noticed earlier. It wasn't marked on any map, and the overgrown vegetation suggested it wasn't regularly used. But something about it called to me, the way forbidden things often do. The trees on either side loomed close, their branches tangling together overhead, creating a tunnel of darkness that seemed to swallow the last light of the day. Each step I took was deliberate, my boots crunching softly against the gravel. The forest felt alive, but not in the way I had hoped. The rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig made my pulse quicken, but when I stopped to listen, the silence was absolute. Even the birds had fallen quiet. The farther I ventured, the more oppressive the air became, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching, waiting. Then I saw it, the clearing. At first glance, it was unremarkable, just a break in the trees where a thin shaft of moonlight filtered through the canopy above. But as I stepped into the open space, my flashlight caught something half hidden in the undergrowth, a single, weathered boot. It lay at an odd angle, its leather cracked and worn, the laces frayed as though they had been chewed on by animals. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down, my fingers trembling as I brushed aside the leaves to get a closer look. The boot was old, far older than it should have been if someone had lost it recently. But what struck me more was the eerie way it seemed deliberately placed, as if someone, or something, had left it there for me to find. My mind raced with questions. Who had left it? How long ago? And why was there no sign of its owner? The sound of a twig snapping behind me sent a jolt of fear through my body. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing. The forest stood still, its shadows deep and unyielding. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt charged, heavy with a presence I couldn't see but could almost feel, like static brushing against my skin. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady as I backed away from the boot. The clearing seemed darker now, the moonlight weaker, as if the forest itself had shifted to block it out. I wanted to run, to turn back and retreat to the relative safety of the RV, but my feet refused to move. Something about the clearing, about the trail, demanded my attention, pulling me deeper into its grasp. Then, the footsteps began. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own steps, but the timing was off. They came from behind me, deliberate and slow, crunching softly against the underbrush. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I turned the beam toward the source of the sound. Nothing. Just the gnarled trunks of trees and the empty trail stretching into darkness. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled me, closer now, their rhythm deliberate, calculated. My heart pounded against my ribs, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where? Back down the trail where the footsteps followed. Into the forest where the shadows seemed to move on their own. I was trapped, frozen in a moment that stretched on forever, with only the faint sound of my own breathing breaking the suffocating silence. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent once more, but the air was different now. Heavier. Darker. I felt exposed, as though every shadow concealed eyes that watched my every move. Slowly, I stepped backward, my flashlight sweeping across the clearing one last time. My breath caught as the beam landed on the boot again, now lying at a different angle, as though it had been moved while I wasn't looking. I ran. I didn't think about where I was going, only that I needed to get away. The narrow trail twisted beneath my feet, the trees blurring as I sprinted toward the dim glow of the campsite in the distance. Every step felt slower, every shadow seemed closer, until I finally burst into the clearing where my RV stood, the firelight still flickering weakly in the cool night air. I slammed the door behind me, locking it in one frantic motion, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. But even as I sat there in the silence, my hands still shaking, I knew I wasn't safe. The footsteps, the boot, the oppressive stillness of the clearing, they weren't just in my head. Something had been there with me. Something that wasn't done yet. And as the wind outside picked up, rustling the trees and rattling the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it had followed me back. The silence inside the RV was suffocating. I sat on the small couch, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand, its beam trembling faintly as it illuminated the cramped interior. The world outside was dark, with only the faint glow of the dying campfire casting flickering shadows across the windows. Every noise, The groan of the RV's frame, the soft rustle of wind outside, felt amplified, each one setting my nerves on edge. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. I knew what I'd heard, the deliberate crunch of footsteps on the trail, the unrelenting stillness of the clearing, and the way the boot had seemed to shift. Something had been there, watching, following me. And now, as I sat in the false security of my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second dragging out longer than the last. I tried to focus on its rhythm, hoping it would drown out the oppressive quiet, but my mind kept drifting back to the moment I'd turned and seen the boot lying askew, its position inexplicably different. The image replayed in my head, over and over, as if my memory were trying to tell me something I couldn't quite grasp. A sudden knock shattered the silence. I froze, the blood draining from my face as my mind raced to process what I had just heard. It wasn't loud, barely more than a tap, but it was deliberate, like someone testing the boundary between outside and in. My breathing quickened, each inhale sharp and shallow as I strained to listen for another sound. My hand tightened around the flashlight, the metal slick against my palm. The knock came again, this time louder. It was coming from the back of the RV, near the small window that overlooked the campsite. I turned, my body rigid with fear, and aimed the flashlight toward the sound. The beam swept over the interior of the RV, the faint yellow glow barely penetrating the darkness outside the window. For a moment, everything was still. Then the scratching began. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. Long, deliberate strokes against the metal siding of the RV, like fingernails dragged across the surface. My breath itched, and I scrambled back against the far wall, the flashlight shaking in my grip as I pointed it toward the door. The scratching moved, circling the RV, the sound trailing from one side to the other, methodical and unhurried. I whispered to myself, a mantra of denial that I barely believed. It's just an animal. A raccoon or a bear. Nothing more. But I knew that wasn't true. Animals didn't behave like this. They didn't knock. They didn't scratch like they were testing the boundaries of a cage. The scratching stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound itself, the absence pressing down on me like a physical weight. My ears strained for any noise, my pulse pounding in my head, but all I could hear was the faint creak of the RV settling on its suspension. I held my breath, waiting, hoping that whatever was out there had gone. And then I heard it, a faint, low whisper, just outside the window. The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, if there were any, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a trick of my mind. Someone, or something, was speaking. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight beam darting toward the window. The curtains were drawn tight, but the thin fabric did little to block out the sensation of being watched. I could feel eyes on me, boring through the walls of the RV, and I knew that whatever was outside wasn't going to leave. The voice came again, louder this time, more distinct. It was still incomprehensible, the words warped and distorted like a recording played backward, but the intent was clear. It wanted me to come outside. My chest tightened as panic took hold. I couldn't stay here, trapped in this tiny metal box, but the thought of stepping outside was even worse. I backed away from the window, my flashlight still pointed toward the sound, and tried to think. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to drive as far as I could and never look back, but my legs refused to move. A sudden bang against the side of the RV made me jump, the sound reverberating through the small space. The entire vehicle shook, as if something heavy had slammed into it, and I let out a strangled cry, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The beam flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls, and I scrambled to pick it up, my fingers fumbling in the dark. The banging came again, harder this time, and I knew I couldn't stay here. I grabbed the keys from the counter and bolted toward the driver's seat, my heart pounding as I jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the RV into gear, the tires spinning on the gravel as I tore out of the campsite. In the rearview mirror, The shadows of the forest stretched long and dark, swallowing the trail behind me. For a brief, horrifying moment, I thought I saw something, a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless and watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. The road ahead stretched into darkness, the narrow gravel path winding through the trees like a snake. I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white, and kept my eyes fixed on the headlights cutting through the night. My breath came in shallow gasps, the adrenaline coursing through my veins making it impossible to think. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. The RV's headlights pierced the dense darkness of the forest as I sped down the gravel road, each bump in turn jarring my already frayed nerves. The trees loomed on either side, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms, clawing at the night sky. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound almost deafening in the suffocating silence of the empty road. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows, but the darkness remained impenetrable. It wasn't just fear driving me, it was the overwhelming sense that whatever had been outside the RV, scratching and whispering, hadn't given up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something unseen keeping pace with me, just out of sight. The oppressive weight of that presence clung to me, wrapping around my chest like a vice, making it hard to breathe. The further I drove, the more the road seemed to stretch endlessly before me, as though I wasn't making any progress at all. The headlights illuminated nothing but more trees and the occasional glint of rocks scattered across the road. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as I tried to shake the growing unease. I was miles from the campsite now. Whatever had been there should have been left behind. But then, a noise broke through the low hum of the engine. It started faintly, almost imperceptible at first, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo in time with the movement of the RV. At first, I thought it might be a loose piece of metal rattling against the frame, but the sound was too deliberate, too measured. It was coming from above. I froze, my eyes darting to the roof of the RV. My mind raced to rationalize it. A branch, maybe, or debris blown onto the roof by the wind. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving from one side of the RV to the other as if whatever was causing it was pacing back and forth. A chill ran down my spine, and I clenched the steering wheel tighter, my gaze flicking between the road ahead and the ceiling. I couldn't bring myself to stop, not now. The thought of pulling over and stepping outside to investigate was unthinkable. I needed to get to the next town, to the safety of people and lights and noise. Anything but the crushing silence of this endless, empty road. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the absence of sound was almost worse than the noise itself. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and stifling, as if the night itself were holding its breath. My hands shook on the wheel, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, even as every instinct screamed at me to look, to check the mirrors, to confirm that I was alone. Then the roof groaned. It was a low, guttural sound, like the creak of old wood under pressure, but it came from the metal roof of the RV. My breath itched, and I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. The sound wasn't just random, it was purposeful, deliberate. Something heavy was moving up there. I pressed harder on the gas, the RV lurching forward as the engine roared in protest. The groaning sound grew louder, and I could hear the faint scrape of something dragging across the roof, slow and methodical. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it an animal? A branch? Or was it something else entirely? A sudden bang jolted me out of my thoughts. The entire RV shook violently, as if something had slammed into it from above. My heart leapt into my throat, and I fought to keep the vehicle steady on the uneven road. The banging came again, this time accompanied by a low, inhuman growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the RV. It was deep and guttural, unlike anything I had ever heard before, and it sent a wave of primal terror coursing through me. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, my eyes scanning the road for any sign of a clearing or a place to pull off. But the forest stretched on endlessly, the trees closing in around me like a living entity. The growling grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the roof was getting closer, bearing down on me. And then, with a deafening crash, the roof buckled. The sound was like metal tearing, and I felt the RV lurch to one side as if something had landed on it with immense force. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and I fought to keep control of the vehicle as it swerved dangerously close to the edge of the road. I could hear the scrape of claws against the metal, the guttural growl, now a low, rumbling snarl that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. I had to get out of there. Desperation took over, and I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, the RV careening forward at a reckless speed. The trees blurred past, their dark silhouettes twisting and shifting in the headlights, and the noise from the roof grew louder, more chaotic. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare glance up. I couldn't face whatever was up there. The road ahead began to narrow, the gravel giving way to dirt and rocks, and I knew I was running out of time. My eyes darted wildly, searching for any sign of an escape, but the forest offered no reprieve. I was trapped, the RV hurtling through the darkness with no clear destination. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The growling, the scraping, the banging, all of it ceased, leaving behind an eerie silence that was almost more terrifying than the chaos. My hands shook violently on the wheel, and I forced myself to slow down, the RV shuddering as it came to a stop in the middle of the road. For a long moment I sat there, the engine idling softly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't dare move, didn't dare turn my head to look. I just stared straight ahead, my mind racing with fear and confusion. And then, from somewhere deep within the woods, I heard it. A low, mournful whistle. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the sound of the engine, but it grew louder, more distinct, echoing through the trees like a haunting melody. It wasn't a sound of nature, it was deliberate, calculated. And it was getting closer. I slammed the RV back into gear and sped off into the night, the whistle following me like a ghostly warning. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me yet. The road stretched endlessly before me, an unbroken ribbon of gravel and dirt cutting through the dense wilderness. The RV's headlights illuminated the path ahead, but beyond that small circle of light, the world was an impenetrable void. I had driven for what felt like hours, but the oppressive presence that had haunted me hadn't faded. It clung to me, a shadow that refused to let go. As the forest grew denser, the road began to narrow, and I found myself gripping the wheel tighter. Every crunch of the tires against the gravel felt deafening in the silence, each turn of the road pulling me deeper into the heart of an unknowable darkness. The night seemed alive, the trees whispering secrets in the wind, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a faint glow cutting through the blackness. It wasn't the sharp, steady light of another vehicle or a distant cabin, but something softer, more diffuse, like the glow of a lantern swaying in the night. It was too far off the road to be accidental, but its faint, almost ethereal quality filled me with unease. I slowed the RV, the engine's hum lowering to a murmur, and squinted through the windshield to get a better look. The glow flickered slightly, as though the wind might extinguish it, but it remained steady, beckoning. Against my better judgment, I felt an inexplicable pull, a compulsion to get closer. Maybe it was the hope of finding someone, anyone, out here in this lonely stretch of wilderness. Or maybe it was just curiosity, the kind that overrides survival instincts and pulls you toward danger. I eased the RV off the road, the tires crunching softly over the gravel shoulder. The forest seemed to press in around me as I parked, the darkness deepening. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the shadows, and stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp against my skin, and carried with it the faint scent of damp earth and pine. The glow was still there, deeper into the woods, and without thinking, I started walking toward it. Each step felt heavier than the last, the ground beneath my boots uneven and littered with twigs that snapped under my weight. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant call of an owl, but underneath it all was a suffocating stillness, as though the night itself was holding its breath. The glow grew brighter as I approached, resolving itself into the unmistakable shape of a lantern hanging from a low branch. But there was no one around. I stopped a few feet away, my breath clouding in the cold night air. The lantern swayed gently, casting shifting shadows that danced across the trees. Its light was warm, golden, but it didn't reach far, fading quickly into the surrounding darkness. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beams slicing through the gloom, but there was nothing, no sign of who had placed it there, no footprints, no path leading away. The silence pressed in, heavier now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Something wasn't right. The lantern's glow seemed too steady, too deliberate, as though it were waiting for me. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening, and reached out cautiously to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, the light went out. Darkness enveloped me, sudden and absolute, and I staggered back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I spun around, the beam jerking wildly as I tried to orient myself, but the forest seemed different now, closer, the trees looming like silent sentinels. My breath came in shallow gasps, my ears straining for any sound, but the silence was complete. And then I heard it. A faint rustling, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. It was subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural sounds of the forest, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the fallen leaves and underbrush. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, my flashlight shaking as I swept it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there, paralyzed, listening. The silence returned, heavier than before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I wanted to run, to bolt back to the safety of the RV, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the ground by an invisible force. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a voice. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Help me!" The words sent a chill down my spine, my stomach twisting into knots. The voice was hollow, distant, as though it were coming from far away and yet impossibly close at the same time. I turned slowly, the flashlight's beam casting wild, frantic arcs through the trees, but there was nothing there. "Help me!" The voice came again, weaker now, almost pleading. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn and run as fast as I could, but something held me there, a morbid curiosity, or maybe a faint hope that someone really was out there, lost, and in need. I called out, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" Silence. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. And then, just as I was about to take a step back, something moved in the corner of my vision. A shadow, barely discernible against the blackness, shifting between the trees. I swung the flashlight toward it, the beam catching a fleeting glimpse of something, a figure, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long and angular. It moved with a strange, fluid grace, slipping between the trees as though it were part of the forest itself. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure stopped, just at the edge of the light, its form obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out a face, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and piercing, as though it were looking straight through me. And then it whispered, "Leave." The word was barely audible, carried on a breath of wind that chilled me to the bone. The figure melted back into the darkness, and the footsteps began again, receding into the woods until they faded completely. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I turned and ran, the flashlight bobbing wildly as I sprinted back to the RV, the sound of my own frantic breaths filling the night. When I reached the RV, I slammed the door shut and locked it, collapsing into the driver's seat with my hands trembling. I didn't dare look back as I started the engine and sped away, the forest swallowing the road behind me. The lantern, the voice, the figure, they were gone, but their presence lingered, a cold weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. And in the distance, just as I rounded a bend in the road, I thought I saw it again, a faint glow, flickering between the trees. The RV felt like a cocoon of safety as I drove further into the wilderness, but the creeping unease refused to let go. The events of the previous night played over and over in my mind, the lantern, the voice, the figure. I had thought that putting distance between myself and that spot would help, but instead, it felt as if the forest itself had come alive, stretching its influence far beyond the boundaries of that single campsite. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, I realized I needed to stop. The road ahead was too narrow, too dark to navigate at night. I spotted a small pull-off with just enough room to park, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to lean closer with each passing moment. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt deafening. The stillness of the forest seemed more oppressive here, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I stepped out of the RV and into the crisp evening air. The faint scent of pine mingled with the damp earth, but beneath it was something else, something faintly metallic, like the smell of rusted iron. I ignored it, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, and set about making a small fire. The flames flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness, their light creating long, twisting shadows that danced across the trees. I sat close to the fire, hoping its warmth would drive away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. But as the night deepened, the oppressive silence became harder to ignore. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping insects, rustling leaves, were absent, replaced by a void that seemed to swallow every noise I made. Then, from somewhere just beyond the firelight, came the sound of branches snapping. My head shot up, my pulse quickening. The sound was deliberate, too heavy to be the wind and too rhythmic to be an animal. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the trees, the beam trembling as I scanned the darkness. The light caught nothing but the twisted shapes of branches and the glint of dew on the underbrush. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. No response. I sat back down, gripping the flashlight tightly, my eyes darting between the fire and the surrounding trees. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and just as I began to think it had been nothing, the sound came again, closer this time. A heavy, deliberate crunch of leaves underfoot. I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The fire cast strange, flickering shadows across the trees, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, something tall and angular slipping between the trunks. I trained the flashlight on the spot, but there was nothing there. And then, just behind me, I heard a low, guttural whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark, but the space behind me was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd heard. The voice had been faint, almost inaudible, but it was unmistakably human, or at least, it had tried to sound human. The fire snapped loudly, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The shadows around me seemed to shift and writhe, closing in, as if the darkness itself was alive. I backed away from the fire, my heart pounding, and stumbled toward the RV. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the latch. The small space felt suffocating, but at least it was enclosed, a barrier between me and whatever was out there. I turned off all the lights and crouched near the window, peering out into the night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim, orange glow over the clearing. Beyond it, the darkness pressed in, thick and impenetrable. And then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the light. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long and angular. It stood motionless, its head tilted slightly as though studying me. My breath caught in my throat, and I ducked below the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sound of movement. But the silence remained unbroken. Slowly, I dared to peek out again, and the figure was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. From the other side of the RV came a soft, deliberate tapping. 3 slow knocks, spaced evenly apart, as if whatever was out there wanted me to know it was still there. My stomach turned to ice, and I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The tapping stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than ever. I sat there, huddled on the floor, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the RV, Every rustle of the wind sent a fresh wave of terror through me. When dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. But as I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't leaving this behind. The shadowy figure, the voice, the tapping, it was all still with me, lingering just out of sight. And as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a shape standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me go. The weight of exhaustion clung to me as I navigated the winding road. The rising sun cast long shadows across the dense forest, its light doing little to dispel the unease that had settled deep in my chest. Every mile I put between myself and the campsite felt like a small victory, but the nagging sensation of being followed wouldn't leave me. I needed a plan, a way to regain control over the creeping dread that had taken root. I pulled into a rest stop, a small, overgrown clearing with a rickety wooden sign marking it as safe for travelers. The place looked abandoned, the picnic tables mossy and cracked, but it would do for a quick stop. I needed to clear my head, reassess, and figure out my next steps. Stepping out of the RV, the cool morning air hit me like a splash of water. I stretched, trying to shake the tension from my shoulders, but the oppressive stillness of the woods seemed to seep into my very bones. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the mundane, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the faint rustling of leaves, the smell of damp earth. But as I leaned against the RV and sipped water from a canteen, a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring at the spot where the shadows of the trees blended into the underbrush. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the subtle sway of branches in the breeze. And then, there it was again. A shadow, impossibly tall and thin, moving smoothly between the trees. The way it moved wasn't natural. It didn't walk or glide, but rather seemed to shift through the spaces, always just on the edge of perception. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light, the lingering effects of too little sleep and too much fear. But the unease wouldn't let go. It clung to me like a second skin, prickling at the edges of my awareness, making every sound feel louder, every shadow seem deeper. I decided to take a short walk, hoping the movement would clear my mind. I grabbed my flashlight and set off down a narrow path leading away from the clearing. The trail was overgrown, the grass damp with morning dew, and the silence was deafening. No birds, no insects, no signs of life. Just the crunch of my boots on the earth and the distant hum of the RV's engine. The further I walked, the heavier the air felt. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. Shadows danced across the ground, shifting with every step I took, and the sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. Then I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper carried on the breeze. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. It came again, this time clearer. A voice, low and distant, calling from somewhere deeper in the woods. "Help me!" The words sent a chill down my spine. They were faint, barely above a whisper, but unmistakably human, or at least, they sounded human. My mind raced with possibilities. Could someone else be out here? Could they be in trouble? Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get in the RV and leave, but the voice called out again, weak and pleading. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The path narrowed, the underbrush closing in around me. The voice grew louder, clearer, but it seemed to shift, coming from different directions as if the woods themselves were throwing it back at me. I called out, my voice shaky, but there was no reply, just the same haunting plea, echoing through the trees. "Help me!" The sound led me to a small clearing, much like the one I'd left behind, but darker, more foreboding. The trees here were gnarled and ancient, their roots twisting across the ground like skeletal fingers. In the center of the clearing was a pile of stones, arranged in a crude, unnatural cairn. The voice had stopped. I stood there, my flashlight casting long, trembling shadows, the air thick with an unspoken threat. The clearing felt wrong, like a place out of step with the rest of the world. I wanted to leave, to run, but I couldn't move. My eyes were drawn to the cairn, to the way the stones seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as if alive. And then, from the darkness beyond the clearing, the voice came again, closer this time, almost directly behind me. "Help me!" I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, silent and unmoving. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As I turned to leave, something cold brushed against my arm, a faint, fleeting touch that sent a jolt of terror through me. I swung the flashlight wildly, but the clearing was empty. I didn't wait to see what might happen next. I ran, the underbrush tearing at my legs, the voice calling after me, growing louder, more insistent. By the time I reached the RV, my lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands, and collapsed onto the floor. My mind raced, trying to process what had happened, but there was no explanation that made sense. As I sat there, gasping for breath, I glanced out the window. The clearing was empty, the woods still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that whatever had called out from the darkness wasn't done with me yet. The sun had long dipped below the horizon by the time I finally stopped driving. Darkness enveloped everything, broken only by the faint glow of my RV's headlights slicing through the endless stretch of road. My fingers were clenched tight around the steering wheel, knuckles white from the pressure. Every shadow that flickered just beyond the reach of the light felt alive, as if it could leap out at any moment. I found a pull-off, a narrow dirt path that led into a cluster of trees. It wasn't a proper campsite, but it would do. I needed rest, or at least a break from the suffocating tension that had wrapped itself around me. The engine hummed to a stop, and the silence that followed was deafening. Stepping out into the cool night air, I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam trembling slightly as my hand refused to steady. The woods were thick here, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if even the wind was afraid to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me from the darkness. I decided to set up a small fire, more for the comfort of light than warmth. The flickering flames cast long shadows against the trees, the shapes twisting and shifting with every gust of heat. I sat in my folding chair, trying to relax, but every creak of the forest and every crackle of the fire made my nerves tighten. I sipped on a bottle of water, but even the simple act of drinking felt wrong, like I was intruding on something ancient and hostile. Then I heard it. A faint rustling, barely audible, coming from deeper within the woods. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I waited, straining to hear, but there was nothing. Just the crackle of the fire, and the pounding of my own heart. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a deer, perhaps, or a raccoon, but the sound didn't feel right. It had been too deliberate, too heavy, like footsteps trying to stay hidden. I forced myself to ignore it, focusing instead on the fire, the warmth of the flames a small comfort against the growing unease. But the rustling came again, closer this time. I whipped my flashlight toward the sound, the beam slicing through the darkness. It landed on nothing but trees and underbrush, the forest as still as a painting. My breath itched, and I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that the isolation and exhaustion were playing tricks on me. And then came the voice. Low, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably human. "Please, help me!" The words sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. They came from the direction of the rustling, deep within the woods. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was someone out there? Were they in trouble? But the voice, it didn't sound right. There was something off about it, something hollow, like it wasn't coming from a person at all. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello? Who's there?" No response. Just the stillness of the forest. I stood, my legs trembling, and took a step toward the edge of the clearing. My flashlight shook in my hand as I pointed it into the trees. "If someone's out there, say something! Are you hurt?" Again silence. I should have gone back to the RV, locked the door, and driven as far away as I could. But something compelled me to stay. It wasn't curiosity, it was something deeper, a pull I couldn't explain. I took another step toward the woods, the voice echoing in my mind. Please, help me! As I approached the treeline, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly it made my breath visible. The fire behind me dimmed, the flames sputtering as if struggling against some unseen force. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest, and scanned the forest one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. Tall and thin, its silhouette blending into the shadows of the trees. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and I took a step back. The figure shifted, not walking but gliding between the trees, its movements unnervingly smooth. The shadows seemed to cling to it, wrapping around its form like a living thing. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to move or look away. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The forest was empty again, the stillness returning with an almost deafening intensity. I stumbled back to the fire, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. The flames had nearly died out, the embers glowing faintly in the darkness. I fed the fire more wood, desperate to keep the light alive, to push back against the encroaching shadows. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my eyes darting between the trees, my ears straining for any sound. The voice didn't return, nor did the figure, but the feeling of being watched never left. It clung to me like a second skin, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone out here. When dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, I felt no relief. The light didn't banish the unease, it only served to illuminate how deeply it had settled into my bones. Something was out there. Something that didn't belong to this world. And it was watching. The night seemed endless, stretching on with a suffocating darkness that pressed against the windows of the RV. Every sound outside felt amplified, every rustle of leaves or creak of wood a reminder of the presence I couldn't see but knew was there. The fire outside had long since died, leaving the campsite shrouded in shadows that seemed to twist and shift with an unnatural rhythm. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel even though the RV was parked. My heart was pounding, and my breaths came shallow and quick. I told myself I was safe, locked inside with the doors bolted and the curtains drawn. But deep down, I knew the truth. Safety was an illusion here. Whatever was out there didn't need a door to find me. The first sound was faint, a distant, hollow whistle that seemed to carry on the still night air. It was the kind of sound that could be mistaken for the wind, except it wasn't. There was a pattern to it, a deliberate cadence that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I strained to hear. The whistle came again, closer this time, and with it, a new sound, footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching against the gravel just beyond the RV. My blood turned to ice as I realized they weren't coming from the main road or another campsite. They were circling the RV, moving in a wide arc, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was studying me, testing my resolve. I reached for the flashlight, my hand trembling as I flicked it on. The beam of light felt pitiful against the darkness, barely illuminating the small area around the RV. My instincts screamed at me to stay inside, but the growing sound of the footsteps made it impossible to sit still. I moved to the small window by the door, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. Nothing. The empty clearing stared back at me, bathed in faint moonlight. The trees at the edge of the campsite loomed tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in a non-existent breeze. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until I could swear they were right outside the door. And then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it made my heart leap into my throat. My hand shot to my mouth, stifling the gasp that threatened to escape. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The knock came again, this time more insistent. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay quiet, hoping that whoever was out there would go away. Hello? The voice was low, raspy, and completely wrong. It sounded human, but there was an edge to it, something that set my nerves on fire. I didn't respond, didn't dare make a sound. I need help. The voice was closer now, just outside the door. Please let me in. My mind raced. No one had been at the campsite when I arrived, and I hadn't seen any other cars or RVs on the road for miles. Whoever was out there hadn't arrived by normal means. I stayed frozen, my breath shallow and silent as I listened. The voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. It's so cold out here. Please, just open the door. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped back from the window, the flashlight shaking in my grip. My instincts screamed at me to run, to start the RV and drive as far as I could. But the figure outside wasn't giving up. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, and with it came a scratching sound, like nails dragging across the metal door. Then, everything went silent. The sudden stillness was more terrifying than the noise. I stood there, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I crept back to the window, barely pulling the curtain aside to look outside. And that's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness, locking onto me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. The figure raised one of its hands, skeletal and pale, and pointed directly at the RV. My breath caught in my throat as it took a single, deliberate step forward. The shadows around it seemed to ripple and twist, as if the darkness itself was alive, drawn to its presence. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed with fear. The figure took another step, and then another, moving with an unnatural grace that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the whistle returned, sharp and piercing, cutting through the stillness like a blade. The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly as if listening. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it melted back into the shadows, disappearing from sight. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I lunged for the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook violently. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the RV lurching forward as I sped out of the campsite. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw it again, a shadow among the trees, watching, waiting. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove through the night, the whistle echoing in my mind, haunting me long after the figure had disappeared. I knew it wasn't over. Whatever it wasn't finished with me. And deep down, I knew I'd never truly escape it. The night stretched on endlessly, the road ahead bathed in the pale glow of the RV's headlights. Every turn of the wheel felt like a step away from reality and deeper into something unexplainable. The forest on either side of the highway was a black wall, impenetrable and alive with whispers I couldn't quite hear. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my heart still racing from the events at the campsite. I had driven for hours, but no distance felt far enough to escape the sense of dread clinging to me like a second skin. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It appeared suddenly, as if it had materialized from the shadows themselves. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a halt mere feet from where it stood. The headlights illuminated the figure, and my stomach turned. It wasn't human. Not entirely. The figure was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its skin was ashen, stretched tightly over a frame that seemed barely capable of holding itself together. But it was the eyes, or lack thereof, that froze me in place. Where eyes should have been were dark, empty voids that seemed to drink in the light, leaving nothing but an abyss that stared back at me. It didn't move. It didn't flinch, even as the engine's rumble cut through the silence of the night. I felt my breath hitch, my hands trembling as I struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. Every instinct screamed at me to drive, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in its gaze, even though it had no eyes. And then it raised a hand. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost mocking. It pointed toward the forest on the side of the road, its bony finger trembling slightly as if urging me to follow. The shadows around it seemed to ripple, reaching out like tendrils eager to pull me into their embrace. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. My voice felt small, useless against the oppressive presence before me. "No." As if in response, the figure tilted its head, its hollow sockets narrowing. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air around me felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. I could feel it pressing against my chest, suffocating me, driving me closer to the edge of panic. Then it began to move. The figure didn't walk, it glided, its movements eerily smooth as it slipped into the trees. The shadows seemed to swallow it whole, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of that growl and the suffocating silence that followed. I sat there, paralyzed, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. My mind raced, torn between the primal urge to flee and the inexplicable pull of curiosity. What was it? Why had it stopped me? Why did it want me to follow? The whistle returned. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. But it grew louder, sharper, cutting through the air like a blade. It wasn't coming from the road. It was coming from the forest. "No," I muttered again, shaking my head more forcefully this time. I wasn't going into the woods. Not after what I'd seen, what I'd felt. But the whistle persisted, its cadence rising and falling in a haunting rhythm that seemed to call my name. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. The night air was cold, biting against my skin as I stepped onto the pavement. The forest loomed before me, its trees twisting into dark, skeletal shapes. The whistle was clearer now, emanating from somewhere deep within the shadows. It wasn't a natural sound. It was too deliberate, too knowing. I took a step forward, then another, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I pointed it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but twisted branches and the faint glimmer of dew on the leaves. Still, the whistle called. And then I saw it. A shape moved in the distance, darting between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to follow, but I caught a glimpse, a pale, skeletal hand brushing against the bark of a tree, a flash of ashen skin disappearing into the shadows. My pulse quickened, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something stronger than fear was pulling me forward, urging me to step deeper into the unknown. I followed the whistle, the beam of my flashlight dancing erratically as my hands shook. The forest seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder with each step. My breaths came shallow and fast, misting in the frigid air as the whistle grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for a sound, any sound, just to break the tension. My flashlight flickered, the beam weakening as if the darkness was swallowing the light itself. I turned in a slow circle, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, the flashlight jerking wildly as I searched for the source of the voice. The forest was empty. But I could feel it, a presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. The voice came again, closer this time. "You can't leave." Panic set in. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root and sending me sprawling to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, its beam cutting out as it hit the dirt. I scrambled to my feet, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I tried to find the path back to the road. The whistle returned, sharper, louder, piercing through the night like a scream. It wasn't calling me anymore. It was mocking me. I ran. Branches clawed at my skin, roots threatened to trip me with every step, but I didn't stop. The whistle followed me, echoing through the trees, its haunting melody growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. When I burst out onto the road, the RV was still there, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. I didn't stop until I reached the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands shook violently as I fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. I didn't look back as I sped down the road, the whistle fading into the distance. But I could still feel it, that oppressive presence, watching me, waiting. And I knew, whatever it wasn't done with me. Not yet. The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast wilderness. The events of the night before had left me shaken, but I couldn't stop now. Every mile felt like I was putting more distance between myself and the haunting figure in the forest. Yet, deep down, I knew I wasn't truly free. The sense of being watched hadn't faded, it clung to me like a shadow, unrelenting. As dawn broke, the pale light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the road. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It had been hours since I left the campsite, but the memory of the figure, its hollow eyes, the skeletal hand, and that unnerving whistle, was burned into my mind. Sleep was out of the question. My nerves were frayed, my body running on adrenaline and sheer willpower. Up ahead, a sign loomed on the side of the road, announcing the next rest stop in 5 miles. I debated whether to stop. Part of me wanted to keep driving, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. But exhaustion was setting in. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my vision blurred from lack of rest. I needed a break, if only for a few minutes. The rest stop was a small, deserted area nestled among the trees. A lone picnic table sat under a towering pine, and a weathered signboard displayed a faded map of the surrounding area. I pulled the RV into the parking lot, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, amplifying the pounding of my heart. Stepping outside, the crisp morning air bit at my skin. The world was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stretched my legs, trying to shake off the stiffness from hours of driving, but the unease in my chest refused to dissipate. My eyes scanned the tree-line, half expecting to see the figure watching me from the shadows. There was nothing, only the dense forest, its secrets hidden beneath a veil of silence. I approached the picnic table, setting down a thermos of coffee I had hastily prepared before leaving the campsite. The warmth of the drink offered a small comfort, but it did little to calm my nerves. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night. The growls, the figure, the whistle, it all felt like a nightmare, too surreal to be real. Yet I couldn't deny what I had seen, what I had felt. As I sipped my coffee, something caught my eye, a movement in the trees. My breath hitched, and I froze, the thermos clutched tightly in my hands. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't the same as before. This figure was smaller, hunched, draped in tattered clothing that hung loosely from its skeletal frame. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. It stopped at the edge of the tree-line, just out of the light, and turned its head toward me. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply stood there, watching. My hands shook as I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dim light of the morning. The figure recoiled slightly, its features momentarily illuminated. Its face, or what remained of it, was a grotesque mask of decay. Sunken eye sockets stared back at me, empty and lifeless. The skin was stretched thin, peeling away in places to reveal sinew and bone beneath. A hollow gasp escaped my lips as I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure took a step forward. I dropped the thermos, the coffee spilling across the ground as I fumbled for my keys. My hands were slick with sweat, my fingers trembling as I tried to steady myself. The figure advanced slowly, its movements deliberate and unhurried. It was as if it knew I had nowhere to go, as if it were savoring the moment. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. The figure didn't react, didn't falter. It just kept coming, its hollow gaze fixed on me. I bolted for the RV, my legs feeling like lead as I stumbled over the uneven ground. The sound of footsteps followed me, slow, deliberate, echoing in the otherwise silent morning. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door, listening. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with anticipation. I peered out the window, my eyes darting frantically across the clearing. The figure was gone. But the unease remained, a suffocating presence that filled the small space of the RV. I didn't wait. Firing up the engine, I pulled out of the rest stop, gravel crunching under the tires as I sped back onto the highway. The trees blurred past, their shadows stretching across the road like grasping hands. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What was it? Why was it following me? The questions went unanswered, the only certainty being that I wasn't alone. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me. And as the whistle returned, faint, distant, but unmistakable, I knew it wouldn't let me go. The road wound deeper into the forest, the towering trees on either side forming a dense, shadowy canopy. The whistle still echoed faintly in my ears, a haunting melody that seemed to follow me no matter how far I drove. My grip on the steering wheel was tight, my knuckles white as I tried to focus on the road ahead. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an unshakable presence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The highway stretched on, deserted and eerie in the growing dusk. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. The beauty of the scene was lost on me. Every inch of my being was consumed by the sense of dread that had taken root deep in my chest. I had to keep moving. Stopping wasn't an option, not anymore. My thoughts spiraled as I replayed the events of the past hours. The figure in the forest, the unnatural whistle, the decayed face of the thing that had emerged from the trees, it all felt like something out of a nightmare. Yet I couldn't dismiss it. It was real. Too real. And it was still out there. As darkness fell, I noticed the faint glow of headlights in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me at first. Another car meant another person, a connection to the normal world I so desperately needed. But the relief was short-lived. The vehicle didn't approach or attempt to pass. It maintained a steady distance, its lights just close enough to remind me of its presence. I tried to brush off the unease. Maybe they were just another driver taking their time, cautious on these winding roads. But the longer they stayed behind me, the more my nerves frayed. I pressed the gas pedal, urging the RV to go faster. The headlights followed, unwavering. The road narrowed as it curved through a dense section of forest, the trees pressing in on either side. My heartbeat quickened, a sickening mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through me. The other vehicle matched my speed, its lights unwavering. "Just pass me," I muttered under my breath, glancing in the mirror again. But the car didn't pass. Instead, it seemed to inch closer, its lights growing brighter and more oppressive. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter. "It's just another driver," I told myself, trying to keep my voice steady. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Something about the way the car moved, deliberate, calculated, felt wrong. It wasn't just following me. It was stalking me. Up ahead, I spotted a small turnout on the side of the road. I made a split-second decision, pulling over and slowing to a stop. The RV shuddered as it came to rest on the gravel, the engine idling. I watched the other car closely, expecting it to continue down the road. But it didn't. The car came to a stop a few hundred feet behind me, its headlights still glaring. My stomach turned as I stared at the lights, their brightness blinding against the encroaching darkness. Whoever was in that car wasn't just another traveler. They were waiting. Watching. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it. No signal. Of course. My chest tightened as I set the phone down, my options rapidly dwindling. I could wait them out, hope they'd lose interest and move on. Or I could confront them, a prospect that sent a shiver of dread down my spine. Before I could make a decision, the headlights flickered. For a brief moment, the road was plunged into darkness, and when the lights came back on, the car was gone. I blinked, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. The vehicle had disappeared without a sound, as if it had never been there at all. The road behind me was empty, the forest silent and still. My breathing was shallow as I stared at the empty stretch of highway. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being toyed with, that whatever had been following me was playing a game I didn't understand. The thought sent a cold chill down my spine. I turned the RV back onto the road, my pulse racing as I picked up speed. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. The whistle returned, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from behind me anymore. It was ahead. The road curved sharply, and as I rounded the bend, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, tall, dark, and motionless. Its features were obscured by the shadows, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a halt. The figure didn't move. It stood there, its head tilted slightly as if observing me. My chest tightened as I stared at it, unable to look away. The whistle grew louder, piercing through the silence and filling the cab of the RV. And then, the figure stepped forward. The figure inched closer, its movements deliberate and unnervingly slow. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it emerge from the shadows, its form becoming clearer with every step. It was humanoid in shape but undeniably wrong. Its limbs were too long, its proportions slightly off, and its gait was unnatural, as though it was learning to mimic a human's walk but hadn't yet perfected it. The whistle that had been haunting me grew louder, now coming from the figure itself. It wasn't a sound made by lips, it emanated from somewhere deep within, like air being forced through a hollow, unnatural vessel. The sound was piercing, almost mechanical, and it sent a sharp chill down my spine. I threw the RV into reverse, my hands trembling on the wheel as I tried to back away. The figure didn't react. It kept moving forward, unbothered by the headlights that illuminated its grotesque form. Its skin was pallid, almost translucent, and as it drew closer, I could see faint, dark veins webbing across its body. Its face was the most horrifying part. It lacked discernible features, only a smooth surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Yet, somehow, I could feel its gaze boring into me. The RV's tires crunched against the gravel as I reversed further, trying to put as much distance between myself and the figure as possible. But the road behind me was narrow and winding, and the forest pressed close on either side. There was no room to turn around, no way to escape without confronting whatever this thing was. The figure stopped abruptly, its head tilting slightly as if it was studying me. The whistle ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the figure raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, unable to look away. The gesture felt deliberate, a silent accusation or command. I didn't understand its purpose, but every instinct screamed at me to run. To get away. To leave this place and never look back. I slammed the RV into drive and floored the gas pedal. The engine roared as I sped forward, the figure directly in my path. I didn't care anymore, I couldn't stop. I had to get out of there. As the RV hurtled toward it, the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its arms still outstretched, even as the headlights engulfed it. And then it vanished. One moment it was there, solid and real, and the next, it was gone, as though it had never existed. The road ahead was empty, the shadows undisturbed. I slammed on the brakes, my chest heaving as I stared at the spot where the figure had stood. There was no sign of it, no trace that it had ever been there at all. I sat in stunned silence, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. My body trembled as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. This wasn't something I could explain or rationalize. It was something far beyond my understanding. The whistle returned, faint and distant, echoing through the forest. It seemed to come from all around me, surrounding the RV like an invisible force. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to keep moving, even if I didn't know where I was going. Anywhere was better than here. I pressed the gas pedal again, my eyes scanning the road ahead for any sign of the figure. But the highway stretched on, empty and desolate, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the faint, haunting whistle that refused to leave me. As I drove, a thought crept into my mind, unbidden and terrifying. The figure hadn't been trying to stop me. It had been pointing. Showing me the way forward. Towards something I couldn't yet see.